By spring, you will birth our son, the mountain man declared to the obese girl. By spring, you will birth our son, the mountain man declared, his voice low, gravelly, and final. Magnolia Maggie. Fairweather froze, her breath catching in the cold air of the cabin. The words struck her like a sentence, not a promise. Snow fell outside the rough timber walls, and the fire flickered weakly in the hearth. Her heart pounded as the man before her, Silas Stone McKenna, stood tall, unyielding, his gray eyes sharp as the steel blade hanging from his belt. "I don't understand," she stammered, her hands trembling. "Why would you say such a thing?" "You'll understand soon enough," Silas replied. "I need an heir, and come spring, I intend to have one." Maggie's blood ran cold. Her father had sold her, traded her for silver and debt forgiveness, and now she was alone on Bear's Den Mountain with a stranger twice her size, known across the valley as the Stone Man, a man who lived without mercy, without laughter, without company. Tears welled in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, "I didn't choose this." For a long moment Silas said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned away from her and threw another log into the fire. Neither did I. Outside, the wind howled against the walls like a warning from the mountain itself. Inside, two broken souls stood on opposite sides of a dying fire, bound by an arrangement neither of them wanted, and a future neither could yet imagine. But before the night was over, Maggie would realize that the man who declared he would make her bear his son was not the monster she feared, but the one person destined to save her life. Magnolia Maggie Fairweather had always been the odd one out in the Fairweather family. While her sisters were slender and praised for their charm, Maggie was mocked for her size and quiet nature. Her hands were soft from embroidery, her voice gentle, her laughter rare. Yet there was a warmth in her that others failed to see. Her father, Henry Fairweather, once a respected merchant, had gambled away their fortune and found himself buried under debt. The townsfolk whispered about his shame, but it was Maggie who bore the cruelest punishment. "She's no use to me," Henry snarled one night after losing his last shipment of silver, "but she'll fetch enough to save this family's name." Those were the words that sealed Maggie's fate. She was sold, like livestock, to Silas McKenna, the solitary mountain man who rarely came down from Bear's Den except to trade pelts or buy supplies. When the deal was struck, the town erupted in gossip. "Poor girl," the blacksmith muttered. "He's colder than the mountain he lives on." "She'll never survive up there," the grocer's wife added. "He's a brute. They say he talks to no one but the wolves." When the wagon left the Fairweather farm, Maggie didn't cry. Her mother looked away. Her father didn't wave. Only the snow followed her into the unknown. By the time the wagon climbed the last ridge, dusk had fallen. Silas McKenna waited outside his cabin, a giant of a man with shoulders like oak and eyes like winter. His hair was dark, falling to his collar, and his beard looked as though it had never known softness. He stood still as stone, watching the wagon approach. "This her?" he asked curtly. Henry Fairweather nodded, avoiding his gaze. "You'll find she's sturdy." Silas's jaw tightened. "Get off my land." Henry blinked, startled. "But I said get off." He didn't raise his voice, but there was something in it, an edge that made even the cruel man who sold his daughter flinch. Without another word, Henry climbed back onto the wagon and left, his wheels vanishing into the snow. For a moment, Silence swallowed the world. Maggie clutched her small trunk, shivering in her thin shawl. I'll, I'll do as you ask, she whispered. Silas looked at her, truly looked, and for a fleeting second, something softened in his expression. Inside, he said simply. The cabin was warm, though sparse. A single bed, a large table, a hunting rifle above the mantel. The air smelled of pine smoke and leather. Maggie's heart hammered as she stepped in. You'll stay here through the winter, Silas said. You'll eat, sleep, and recover. You got nothing to fear from me. But you said, Maggie's voice cracked, you said I'd bear your son. Silas turned toward her, his expression unreadable. A man says many things to protect what's his. I don't belong to anyone, she whispered. He nodded. You're right. You belong to yourself now. Outside, the snow began to fall heavier, blanketing the mountain in silence. And for the first time since leaving home, Maggie felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safety. She didn't yet know it, but this mountain, this man, and this winter would change everything she believed about love, trust, and her own worth. The following days were carved from ice and silence. Bear's Den was merciless in winter, a place where even the wind carried weight. Maggie woke each morning to frost on the window and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting through the cabin. At first, she barely spoke. She cooked in silence, mended her shawl, and tried not to look at the man who shared the small space with her. Silas, for his part, seemed made of stone and solitude. He left before dawn, carrying an axe and rifle, returning only when the sky turned purple. His voice was few words, his footsteps steady. Yet, without saying much, he always made sure she had what she needed. Wood stacked by the hearth, a pot of stew kept warm, her boots drying by the fire. One morning, as Maggie swept the floor, her gaze fell upon a carved wooden cradle tucked beneath a blanket in the corner. It was simple but beautiful, smooth curves and carved stars along its sides. She knelt beside it, brushing the dust with her hand. Whose was this? She asked softly. Silas froze at the door. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, my wife carved it for a child that never came. The air grew heavy. Maggie lowered her eyes, guilt flooding her. I'm sorry. Don't be, he said, his voice flat but not unkind. That's long behind me. But she saw the way his fingers tightened on the rifle strap before he stepped outside. That night, the wind screamed across the mountain like mourning. Maggie couldn't sleep. She rose, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and walked to the door. Through the crack, she saw Silas sitting on the porch, snow gathering on his shoulders, eyes fixed on the moon. You'll freeze, she whispered, stepping out. I've known colder nights, he replied. Maggie hesitated, then offered the blanket. Here, at least take this. He stared at her, the small gesture, the trembling hands, the woman who had been sold yet still had kindness to spare. Slowly, he took the blanket, draping it over his shoulders. Thank you. It was the first time he had ever said the words to her. In the days that followed, something began to shift. Maggie stopped counting the hours. She learned how to tend the fire properly, how to patch a torn coat, even how to trap small game. Silas showed her where to find the animal tracks, how to read the sky before a storm, how to listen to the forest rather than fear it. One afternoon, when her hands were numb from gathering snow to melt, Silas approached quietly and placed his gloves over her fingers. Keep them, he said, but they're yours. They're warmer on you. Her cheeks flushed. You're kinder than you look. He gave a small huff of a laugh, the first sound of amusement she'd ever heard from him. Don't spread that around, he said. By February, the cabin no longer felt like a prison. It was a home, filled with quiet laughter, clumsy lessons, and long evenings by the fire. Sometimes Silas would read from a weathered Bible, his deep voice soft and steady. Sometimes Maggie would hum while sewing, her voice low and sweet, carrying through the logs. One evening, she looked up from her stitching and said almost shyly, I think I understand now. Understand what? Silas asked. Why you said I'd give you a son by spring. He froze, meeting her eyes. You didn't mean it as a command, she continued. You meant hope. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, slowly, Silas nodded. I've lived too long with silence. I thought maybe, if I gave someone a reason to stay, I might hear laughter again. Maggie's heart swelled. She smiled through the shimmer of tears. Then you already have. Outside, the snow began to melt in the soft light of March. The mountain was thawing, and so were they. By the time spring began to tease the mountain, the cabin no longer felt like a cage of wood and silence. It had become something living, warm, breathing, and full of small miracles. The snow melted from the roof in gentle drips. The creek outside sang again, and for the first time since her arrival, Maggie woke to birdsong instead of wind. She moved through her days with purpose now. The woman who had arrived trembling and uncertain was gone. In her place stood someone quietly strong. She cooked hearty stews, scrubbed the floors until they shone, and filled the window sills with jars of wild flowers she picked on her walks. Every corner that once whispered loneliness now hummed with life. Silas watched it all with quiet wonder. He had not realized how deeply silence had settled into his bones until she broke it. He'd find himself pausing in his work just to listen to her humming, her laughter when she burned bread, even the gentle scolding she gave the stubborn old mule. One afternoon, as Maggie hung laundry outside, Silas was repairing the fence nearby. You don't have to do all this, he said. I didn't bring you here to work. She smiled without turning. Then why did you bring me here? He hesitated, hammer in hand. Because I thought I needed someone to carry my name. Turns out I needed someone to carry my peace. Maggie turned, meeting his eyes. There was no teasing in his tone, no command, only truth. And in that moment, something shifted between them, quiet but undeniable. That evening, she cooked venison stew, the air rich with rosemary and smoke. When she handed Silas his bowl, he hesitated before taking it. You've made this place more than a house, he said softly. You've made it feel like home. Her cheeks warmed. I just did what anyone would. He shook his head. No, not anyone. After dinner, they sat by the fire. Silas carved small figurines from wood scraps, a wolf, a bear, a small woman holding a flower. Maggie sewed a quilt, its patchwork colors glowing in the firelight. Do you ever miss the town? Silas asked after a long silence. Maggie looked into the flames. No, there's nothing there for me anymore. My father made sure of that. He studied her face, the soft sadness in her eyes, the strength underneath. You deserved better than what he gave you. So did you, she said quietly. He smiled, just barely, but enough to make her heart skip. Days passed, and their routines became something like a rhythm. They tended the garden together, mended the roof, and gathered sap from the maple trees. Every evening, Silas built the fire while Maggie read aloud from the old Bible or from letters she found tucked in drawers, old notes his wife had written, simple words of faith and gratitude. "I'm sorry," Maggie said once, closing a letter and setting it aside. "If this hurts you?" "It doesn't," Silas said, his voice steady. "It reminds me that love doesn't die. It just waits to be found again." One evening, a storm rolled across Bear's den, fierce and sudden. The cabin shuddered beneath the wind. Lightning flashed, and Maggie flinched as thunder shook the walls. Silas crossed the room, kneeling beside her. "You're safe here," he said, placing a steady hand over hers. Something in his voice, low, sure, protective, melted every wall she'd built around her heart. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I know." The storm raged on, but inside it was quiet. The fire glowed, their hands still touching, neither of them moving away. By morning, the world was washed clean. The air smelled of pine and rain. Maggie stepped outside, the damp earth soft beneath her bare feet, and saw Silas standing by the fence, sunlight breaking over his shoulders. She walked to him and said softly, "When you first brought me here, I thought you'd stolen my life." He turned, brow furrowed. "And now? Now I see you gave it back to me." He didn't speak, just reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The gesture was gentle, reverent. For both of them, it was enough. That night, as they sat by the fire, Maggie leaned her head against his shoulder. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. The mountain outside whispered with new life, and in the quiet of the cabin, love finally found its home. Spring arrived in full bloom. Wild flowers climbed the slopes, the air smelled of cedar and soil, and the streams sang louder each day. For a while, Bear's den was untouched by the world. Maggie and Silas lived in quiet harmony, planting crops and laughing softly over shared meals. But peace, Maggie would soon learn, was the mountain's most fragile season. It began with the echo of wagon wheels. Silas was chopping wood when he heard it, the crunch of hooves and the squeal of metal. His body stiffened. He hadn't heard a sound like that in nearly a year. Maggie looked up from the garden, sensing the shift in his face. "What is it?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Trouble," he muttered. Minutes later, the wagon crested the ridge. Two men sat inside, and the one holding the reins made Maggie's breath catch. Henry Fairweather, her father. He looked worse than she remembered, thinner, meaner, with whiskey burning in his eyes. "Well," he sneered, climbing down, "don't you look cozy up here, girl? Fat little Maggie, playing house with a hermit." Silas stepped between them, his presence immediately filling the space. "You got no business here, Henry." Henry smirked. "Oh, I think I do. You bought her, didn't you? She's my daughter, my property, and I've come to collect what's mine, or what she owes me." Maggie's voice trembled. "You sold me, Papa. You gave me away." "I made a deal, not a donation," Henry snapped. "You were supposed to make him rich, bear his son, give him land, whatever fool's dream he wanted. Don't tell me you haven't done your part yet." The insult sliced deep. Maggie stepped back, tears filling her eyes, but Silas didn't flinch. His jaw tightened like granite. "She owes you nothing," he said. "I paid your debts. She's free." Henry laughed cruelly. "Free? Nothing's free in this world, mountain man. I've got men in town who'd pay good money to see what you're hiding up here. Maybe I'll take her back and sell her proper this time." Silas's hand moved to his rifle. "Get off my land." Henry's smirk faltered. "You wouldn't shoot me?" Try me." The silence stretched, thick as the air before a storm. Henry stared at him, at the man he'd underestimated, at the woman he no longer controlled, and something flickered in his eyes. Shame or fear? "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Both of you." He spat into the dirt and climbed back onto his wagon. The wheels creaked, the horses snorted, and within minutes he was gone. When the last sound faded, Maggie collapsed to her knees, her sobs raw. "He won't stop, Silas. You don't know him. He'll come back." Silas knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms. "Then he'll have to get through me first." That night, the fire burned low. Maggie couldn't sleep, her mind spinning with fear. Silas sat by the hearth, staring into the flames. "He'll go to the sheriff," she whispered. "He'll tell them lies, that you kidnapped me, forced me." Silas's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of old memories. "Let him talk. I've faced worse men with bigger guns." "You could leave," she said suddenly, "before they come." He turned to her, his expression softening. "And leave you here? Never." "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. Silas stood, stepping closer. The firelight flickered across his face, the scars, the shadows, the man she once feared but now trusted more than anyone. "Because you're not a debt, Maggie. You're the only thing that's ever made this place feel alive. I'd die before I let someone take that away." Her tears slowed. She rose, touching his cheek with trembling fingers. "Then we'll face him together." Silas covered her hand with his own. "Together," he agreed. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, not of a storm, but of hooves. The mountain was holding its breath again, and Maggie Fairweather was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in chains. She was the woman who would stand her ground beside the man she loved. 3 days later, the storm arrived. But it wasn't rain that came roaring up Bear's Den. It was men. Maggie heard them first, the sound of horses and shouting drifting up the ridge. Silas was already at the window, his rifle steady, his eyes hard as granite. "He's brought the sheriff," he muttered, voice low, "and 3 hired guns." Maggie's stomach twisted. "What are we going to do?" "We stand our ground." By the time the wagon reached the clearing, Silas had stepped outside, his tall frame framed by the cabin door. Maggie stood just behind him, her trembling hands gripping the edge of the doorframe. Henry Fairweather swung down from his saddle, a cruel grin on his lips. The sheriff, a weary man with a silver badge dulled by dust, dismounted beside him. "There she is!" Henry shouted, pointing. "That's my daughter. He took her by force, held her here all winter." Silas's voice carried through the mountain air, calm and clear. "She's free, Sheriff. Ask her yourself." The sheriff hesitated, glancing toward Maggie. "Ma'am, is that true?" Maggie stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "It is. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. He saved me, from my father, from a life I didn't choose." "Don't listen to her," Henry barked. "She's confused, poisoned by his lies." Silas's jaw flexed. "Enough," Henry sneered. "You think you can steal my property and hide up here like some kind of saint? You're nothing but a murderer playing farmer." The insult cut through the air like a blade. Maggie turned to Silas in shock. "What does he mean?" Silas didn't flinch. "He means I fought in the war, and I killed when I had to." He turned his gaze back to Henry. "But I don't kill cowards who sell their daughters for money." Henry lunged forward, hand reaching for his pistol. The sheriff shouted, "Henry, don't!" But it was too late. The gun barely cleared the holster before Silas's rifle thundered once, echoing off the cliffs. Henry fell backward into the dirt, his face frozen in disbelief. The sheriff rushed to his side, but it was useless. Henry Fairweather was gone. Silence fell, broken only by the soft hiss of the wind. The hired guns exchanged looks, then turned their horses around. None of them wanted to fight the man who could shoot lightning from steel. The sheriff rose slowly, dusting off his coat. "It was self-defense," he said, "and God knows the man had it coming." He turned to Maggie, eyes kind. "You're free now, ma'am. No one's coming to take you again." When the riders finally disappeared down the ridge, Maggie sank to her knees. The weight of months, of fear, shame, and survival, broke loose in a flood of tears. Silas knelt beside her, gathering her in his arms. "It's over," he whispered. "You're safe now." "No," she said through her sobs, clutching his shirt. "We're safe." The mountain wind howled through the pines, carrying away the last trace of Henry's cruelty. In its place was only peace, raw, quiet, and hard-earned. The spring that followed was the gentlest the mountain had seen in years. The snow melted into silver streams, wildflowers covered the slopes, and sunlight finally lingered on Bear's Den long after dusk. The cabin, once silent and cold, was now alive, smoke curling from the chimney, laughter drifting through open windows. Maggie moved with quiet confidence, her hands shaping bread, her voice humming softly as Silas repaired the roof. There were still moments when she'd wake at night, haunted by echoes of her father's voice, but when she turned and felt Silas's arm around her, the fear dissolved like frost in sunlight. He always whispered the same words, "You're safe here." Sometimes, when the wind was calm, they'd sit on the porch in silence, watching the valley below. "You know," Maggie said one evening, leaning against him, "when you told me I'd bear you a son by spring, I thought it was a curse." Silas chuckled, his deep voice rumbling against her ear. "And now?" "Now I think it was a prophecy," she smiled, resting a hand over her growing belly. He turned to her then, this woman who had once trembled in his home, now the heart of it, and kissed her forehead. "You've given me more than a son, Maggie. You've given me life again." A breeze swept through the pines, carrying the scent of earth and promise. Maggie looked out across the valley, eyes shining. "Then let's never forget what it cost us to find it." Silas nodded, his arm tightening around her. "We won't." As the sun sank behind the peaks, painting the sky gold, the mountain stood witness, not to pain or fear anymore, but to love rebuilt from ruin. And for the first time, the house on Bear's Den truly felt like home. Every love story leaves its mark, some written in tears, some in laughter, and some carved into the quiet heart of a mountain. Maggie and Silas taught us that love isn't born from power or possession, but from choice. The choice to protect, forgive, and begin again. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whether it's a city apartment or a quiet countryside, know this: healing is possible, and kindness can grow even from the hardest soil. Tell me, where are you watching from? Because stories like this aren't just told, they're shared heart to heart across the world.